Today we're going to practice some techniques to use with watercolor. So first of all, you need a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. We're going to fold that a few times to give us some different sections for each type of technique we're going to try. So fold it in half once, so it looks something like this. And then we'll fold it in half again. Now it looks like this. Crease it really well. Okay, and then we're going to bring this end down, so we're folding it one more time, different direction, and crease it. Now when we open this up, it will be divided into equal sections. And that is where we're going to record each of the techniques that you'll be able to use in your later assignments using watercolor. Now that we have our paper folded, I'm going to have you write some things on here because this is going to become our reference page to use when we are painting. It's a good idea to create reference pages when you're doing a project, especially if you're trying out a new medium, just so that you know how things react. And sometimes I do that on whatever scraps are laying around, and if you keep a journal you can paste that into it later, and then if you're ever doing something similar to it again, you can go back and refer to it. Alright, so I'm going to write the following. Wet on wet. Okay, so write that on your paper as well. Okay, in the next box I'm going to write the words wet on dry. And down here I'm going to write the words lifting color. Box next to it, we'll write the word or words add salt, and then in parentheses I'm going to write the word texture, and we don't leave the salt on there. It's what's left behind that implies texture. Okay, the next one I'm going to write plastic wrap, stuff that you use to cover food before you put it in storage. So texture again. Okay. Next to that, I'll write the words wax, resist. Alright. And in my bottom box, I am going to write scratching. Okay, and then this last box, I like to have you write your name, not just the word name, but you write your name because this is going in as part of your journal, that type of thing. And if you're in one of my classes, I need you to write homeroom teacher. So first and last name, homeroom teacher. And if you'd like, you can write the date and what you're doing. So you could write the words watercolor techniques. Okay, so that's what you're. There you go. All right. Now, in order to complete today's activity or reference page, you need a watercolor brush. This one just happens to be size 7. Whatever you have handy will work. Some clean water, paper towel, and some pan watercolors, semi-moist. I happen to have Crayola here today in the oval pans, and I've used them a little bit. If they haven't been used at all, you'll notice that they seem dry, but semi-moist means you have to add some water to them to activate them, to get them to do something. Alright, so let's start creating our reference page. At the very top, I have wet on wet and wet on dry. So what I'm going to do is get my brush wet, and I'm looking at it, it's like, yep, it's clean, because sometimes people forget to wash their brushes out, depending on if you're in a room where you're borrowing someone else's brush. Always check, make sure it's clean. Yep, it's good. Alright, so I'm going to get it wet again. And now I'm going to put some water on the space that I want to paint. Plain water, nothing else. and that's wet surface. Now we're going to take wet paint, and I think I'll use purple or violet. Okay, and I'm going to just touch the areas like I was making dots, and I might make a wavy line. And what you might notice is the lines start to fade out, or they get fuzzy. So this is a technique you could use for blending a couple colors together. So if you wanted to play around a little bit, put another color in between just to see what happens. But the whole idea is to say, what happens when my surface is wet? What does it look like? That way you can make an informed decision when you're working on your art. Alright, so next, wet on dry. So the dry is the surface that we're working on. The wet will be the paint as we put the watercolor on the paper. So I'll use blue this time, and I'll do the same thing. So that way I can compare something similar. Here's dots. Not much happening. They're staying in their same form. Very crisp lines, not fraying out. Bolder colors, you might notice. So wet and dry gives you more control over where the paint goes. The cool thing about wet though, is wherever you put water, the paint tends to follow that water and not go anywhere else, unless you get more water next to it. Okay, so if you really want to prove to yourself that this works, I'll go back and put red, even though I use purple and red on that side. I can put some red dots in here and crisscross over, and look at that. No crazy blending going on there. So it depends on what you're looking for. Two different techniques. Okay, the next one is called lifting color. So I'm going to choose a color. Again, let's stay away from our light colors like yellow and orange right now, just because they're not going to show the techniques as well. Doesn't mean you couldn't use them, but for today, let's just avoid those colors. So I'm going to use some brown and put that on here. And you can see it's kind of dark at one end, light at the other. So I'm going to darken it up a little bit more. Maybe. Might have to add some more water to it. We'll see. The more water you add to watercolors, the lighter the color tends to be. So I've got a pretty good set of brown there. And the cool thing about watercolors is as they dry, you can go back and make changes to them still, because anytime you add water to it, it comes back to life, so to speak. Now, I don't know if I can, I'm going to try lifting some color out right now. So I cleaned my brush, and lifting color simply means you come back in with a paper towel, with something, and I've got a wet brush here, and I'm just lifting some of that color, soaking it back up, sort of like a sponge. Okay, so that you can create designs that way, or highlights. Working on petals of a flower or something, you might need some highlights where you need to pull the color back out. So you lift it out, and then you get these cool effects. Alright, and you can still do that after it dries, usually. Alright, the next one says add salt or texture. Again, I said we don't leave the salt on there, because sometimes my students think, well, I put it on there for texture. But the salt leaving it on there can damage your artwork later, not to mention it feels really kind of nasty because it's so gritty. When you go to pick it up and move it around, salt keeps falling off of it. So this is something where you have to do it while the paper's wet. So I've got my color in here, nice and bold. And the paper must still be wet or this technique does not work. Salt can be table salt from your kitchen. It can be coarse or fine. The stuff I have today is coarse salt. It's also stuff that you'd use in your kitchen, but it's just bigger chunks or bigger flakes, whichever way you want to call it, granules. So I'm going to drop that on there. Alright, and we're just going to let that dry for a little bit. After it dries, we'll just brush it off so that we don't have the actual salt crystals in place, but we'll see what happens. And you may have already noticed that if you have enough paint there, it's starting to draw toward the salt crystals. And you might be able to predict the type of effect it will have. I'm getting ready for my next one. So I got a little piece of plastic wrap. Okay, stuff we use to cover food before you put it in the refrigerator or store it. Okay, so I got that ready. And I'm going to brush off my salt that I spilled and pick another color for that space. So let's see. Again, I want something dark so that you can see it well. I think I'll try blue. Maybe I'll do 2 colors just to try it. Alright, blue, and I'll do some violet or purple. Okay, we'll blend the 2 next to each other. Kind of let them wash into each other there. Okay. Again, this has to be done while this is still wet. If it isn't, you're not going to get any results. Now this plastic has to be all wrinkled, and you stick it down in the paint while it's still wet. If you have paper that's absorbing your paint too quickly, this may not give you the results you hope for. Like I said, watercolor paper gives you the best because it doesn't absorb all the water. So I'm holding this in place for a little bit because I know that this plastic wrap I'm using doesn't want to stay. Sometimes it'll stay right there for you, but since this is such a small space, I'll give it a minute. Okay. While I'm holding that in place, you need to have a light colored crayon like yellow, pink, white. I happen to have yellow and white. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and get my fingers off of there. And I'm going to work on the spot that says wax resist. Crayons are made of wax. They melt. If you've ever melted wax, it's kind of fun to melt crayons down and make new things out of them or make art with them. So, wax resist. Wax, when something resists something, it prevents it from doing something. In this case, it prevents something from sticking to a space that you put the crayon down in. Alright, so I'm just going to draw a little bit with my light colored crayon. Okay. And I'm going to switch to my white one just for fun here. And the white obviously won't show up until we have added our Alright, added our paint. So I've pressed those fairly hard to make sure there was enough wax here to do the actual resist portion. Now I'm going to choose another dark color, bold color, so that when I go over this, I will be able to see the effects well. So let's see. I haven't used... I guess I'm going to go with purple. Decisions, I tell you. Alright. Here we go. Paint that across there. If you're purple paint or violet paint, whichever name you prefer to call it, is drying out like mine was, add a little more water to it, and then you'll see the effect. So there, all the design that I had put in with my crayon, all that wax resisted the paint wherever the wax was, and now you can see my little message, my little designs, little drawing. Okay, so that's wax resist. Great for outlining things. If you want to do an outline and then paint in each section, it kind of holds the paint where you want it. Or you don't have to worry about crisscrossing over it because it shows through. Alright, and I've gotten a little paint on my fingers. I say I put some in my next spot. But scratching, I'm just using a paper clip. You can use anything that has the ability to scratch. And I bent it out a little bit. And I'm just going to scratch into the paper so I disturb the fibers, but I'm not actually tearing all the way through. Okay, so let's see if I can do that without destroying my paper. So I'm scratching into it, and some of you may have figured this out by accident. You've drawn over a piece of paper, you pressed really hard on something above it, and you get those grooves, those little valleys in your paper, and when you're drawing, all of a sudden this white image comes through, or like the detective movies, they find the secret message by scribbling over the next piece of paper to see what was written before. Something like that, but then in this case we're disturbing the fibers, and wherever the fibers are disturbed, it's going to cause it to absorb more of whatever we put on the paper, in this case watercolor paint. So we'll see if that comes true, and I think I'll use some green. I haven't used any green yet. Let's see. Yep. I want to make sure I didn't get too much water in there. And I'm going to paint across and see if my method here worked. A little bit more water. Alright, so there's my word. It says cool. And green just happens to be a cool color. So, there you go. Scratching is something you can do if you want a certain spot of your paper to pick up more paint and become darker. Alright, now let's see if I can reveal my plastic wrap that's been sitting here so nicely. Ooh, there we go. That worked perfectly. Alright, so some paint will be left on here. I reuse these sometimes, so set that aside. But as you can see, it left a textured, that crinkly look from the plastic wrap has now taken over part of your paint. So that is a technique you could use in your artwork. And I'm looking over here and trying to see if this seems to be dry enough, so I'm going to brush off the salt real quick. Take it over to the trash. It wasn't quite as dry as I thought, but it's good enough to show you what I should have waited a little bit longer. But you can see the little blooming effect that happened around the salt granules, so it leaves that design behind. And there are other techniques. These are just a few that I've shown you today. There are many others that you could try, or combinations that you can try. But this is just a reference sheet to help you along your way as you're starting out with watercolors.